welcome to our final panel of what has been, I think, truly a wonderful day. We've been talking a lot about archives, and now we're going to talk about something a little bit different, which is the other thing that historians deal with, which is objects, and where they come from, and why they end up in museums, and how we present them to the public, and material culture in general. So we're moving perhaps away a little bit from the textual archive into something different. And our moderator for today is Professor Christian Fuhrmeister, who is in the Central Institute for Art History in Munich. He's also a member of our selection committee, so thank you to you and to all of our other selection committees who are sitting with us for your work. And he works on 20th century art history and also looted objects, which is a more recent interest. So on to you.
Thank you very much. I feel really very honored to be tasked with the role of facilitating this ongoing discussion, because there are three, let's say, very creative, very original and independent voices and positions that we're going to encounter, and I feel very honored to be part of this. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you first the three panelists, the three speakers. First, to my right, Dr. Mirjam Brusius, who is a research fellow at the German Historical Institute in London. She has a professional education history that has to do with art history proper in photography in Berlin, but then a PhD in the history of science. I would like to call her a cultural historian, but also / public historian, if that is appropriate. And so she is also working on her Habilitation, second book, in London at the German Historical Institute. Welcome to the panel. The second speaker, and I'm quickly introduce all three of them in a row, because before they start their presentations. The second is Nana Oforiatta Ayim. She is a writer, author, art historian, also public historian, and also filmmaker. As a writer, you may have heard of her novel Godchild that was just published last year in German too. She is also a lecturer in the history and theory of architecture in London as the Architectural Association. She has initiated a whole range of different projects, notably in Ghana, including the founding and being the director of ANO, the Institute of Arts and Knowledge in Accra in Ghana. That came along with a Pan-African cultural encyclopedia that is an ongoing work or work in progress. She has also developed a new system for a mobile museum for the presentations. She has curated the Ghana Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2019, and right now is working on or curating a part of the Dakar Biennale. She is also pursuing a PhD at museum studies in Oxford, and she's on the Presidential Committee on Ghana's Museum and Cultural Heritage Board, and being special advisor for the Minister of Culture of Ghana in this role, and looking forward to opening the National Museum in Ghana on 1st of July. So again, another multi-personality. And finally, the third speaker is Natalia Romik, who studied political studies in Warsaw, and then did a PhD in architectural history, which is also not maybe the most common succession of events here. She has done a great work with many initiatives, exhibitions, and let's say research initiatives, also collective endeavors. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris, and is working there on her turning her latest research project, which is on hideouts, into a book publication. So let me welcome the three panelists on the board here. And in order to get you a better understanding what they are doing, we are a panel heavily relying on visuals. So we're going to have three short 5-minute presentations, one after the other.
Thank you very much for the kind introductions. The first time I'm being introduced as a public historian, so that's interesting, and I think also a good thing. I'll think about that and embrace it. Also, a real pleasure to share the panel with you all. We have met before. I read Nana's book, and we met in Ghana earlier, and also really nice to meet you, Natalia. Yes, so first slide is up. We just said we're not going to talk about archives, but I really did start out looking at archives, but visual archives, photo archives. So my first two books were about history of photography and how photography was used at the excavation site and how photography was used as a tool in order to turn artifacts into knowledge, and photography as a tool in order to find out what it is that interested people at the museum, at these excavation sites, about these objects. And so that's the photo on the right. That's kind of what I started out with, early calotype. But then, very quickly, I became more interested in the objects that were actually depicted on these photographs, and I started sort of questioning where they came from and how, and that's the two images on the left and in the middle. And so, but very much at the beginning I focused on a sort of imperial narrative that looked at, how the British Museum documented its own story about the arrival of these objects. And obviously that was a narrative that was very much focused on single, male, white, elite narratives. And so, what really was a turning point was to find out that many of the objects that I looked at, they were not actually put on display. They often ended up in storage. And here you see an example of the Ishtar Gate that is now on display at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, or I should say a sort of fake version of it is on display. Much of it is not actually the real stuff. Much of the real bricks and tiles, they ended up in various storage rooms around the city, now first in these boxes that you see on the right, and then now in sort of fancy storage facilities. And so that really the question arose for me, so why keep these objects if they're not actually needed? And also, at the same time, in Babylon, there were attempts to reconstruct the Ishtar Gate at the actual, in situ, at the actual place where these objects came from, notably, again, with reconstructed tiles. And so, so it's that kind of question that I'm interested in. Why are we keeping objects in European museums? What is that urge? And so, that sort of resulted in a book, another book that I co-edited on museum storage and the meaning of museum storage, where the majority of objects are held today. And another theme I'm interested in is the movement, obviously, of objects in various directions. So here you see the former director of the British Museum, Neil McGregor, how he doesn't return, but gives on loan the Cyrus cylinder to the then museum director of the National Museum in Tehran. And I think it's an interesting example also for Israel, obviously, because it's an object that really has multiple meanings and different meanings for different peoples. And so here we also see how it's not easy to find out, where objects should actually be returned to. So it has it's an important object for Iran, it's an important object for Babylonian people, it's an important object for Jewish people. And so that question, where it actually belongs, while it's actually sitting at the British Museum, so it's those kind of questions sort of non-easy way out questions I'm interested in when it comes to repatriation. And Neil MacGregor has also famously published a book called A History of the World in 100 Objects, in which he tells the story of the British Museum through 100 objects. And it's become a sort of bestseller 10 years ago. And so obviously, I am, 10 years on, with all the discussions that are currently going on in the heritage scene, I sort of felt, okay, it's really time to turn around this story. And so I co-initiated a collaborative project that also turns around the title of that book. And we now calling this 100 Histories of 100 Worlds in One Object. As I explained earlier, because one object can have many stories. And so obviously I focus on Middle Eastern objects. He includes the flood tablet. So I'm kind of asking, what is an alternative history of this kind of object? We have here photographs, again, of people excavating these objects, but who are they? Who are their names? Is there a record of them in the archive? Then we have photographs that show sites like Palmyra that are empty, sort of give the idea of terra nullius, where there was nothing there when the European excavators arrived. However, we now know there was a village inside that the French forces removed in order to turn this into a tourist site. So these are the sort of bottom-up counter-archival questions that I'm trying to look at. And here you get an impression of that collaborative side where people publish stories, their own sort of viewpoints of objects, also some Middle Eastern, as you can see here. And we also shifted the geographical focus in as much as we did not launch the project in London, but we went to the West Indies, to Kingston in Jamaica, because it's here where the kernel of the British Museum actually came from, through Hans Sloane, who, with the support of the transatlantic slave trade, brought the first objects to Britain in the 17th century. And so the site where we met was a former plantation, and again, this goes back to some of the things about exploited labor that we already heard today. And so just to finish things off, there's obviously also a contemporary political dimension to these stories. We don't just tell historical stories, but we also look at, okay, the history of archaeology in the Middle East is linked, for example, with the history of economic exploitation and the history of oil and extraction, material extraction. So what does it mean if an exhibition like the Ashobani Pal exhibition at the British Museum is funded by a company like BP? What does it mean if there's a cartoonist in Egypt that one of our authors worked with, feels that it's easier to travel from Egypt to Europe as a mummy than as a modern Egyptian. So we're trying to also connect ideas of movement, of artifacts, with the movement of human people, just to also give it this contemporary and political twist and meaning.
Thank you very much. Maybe now you can continue.
Okay. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you to the Dan David Prize. Thank you all for staying. I know it's been a long day. And thanks, yeah, I'm happy to be here with everyone. So, my research started, this kind of research life started when I was studying African art history in London. And I was looking at my own art, or the art from my country, Ghana, and all of the tools and methodologies that I was being asked to look at my, at the time, the contemporary expression from my country and the historical they were all Western philosophies, Western ontologies, Western epistemologies, there were hermeneutics, semiotics, phenomenology, etc. And so especially when looking at the historical work, I started asking myself, what were the terms on which these objects, these artworks, these expressions were made on? What were the contexts? What were the concepts? And I came up with nothing, which was strange to me because I was at SOAS, which had a vast library of, books on everything that you could imagine. So I started digging deeper and deeper. I found one, I think, dictionary of Akan aesthetics, and again, that was it. And so I went parallel, and in Nigeria, I found a book by an author called Roland Abiodun, who wrote about Yoruba art and aesthetics, and that kind of set me off on this journey to find, what are the concept, the term, the context within which we have created over centuries and centuries and centuries. Obviously, we have a long, as long as anyone else, history of creation. And so it's been kind of a really long journey. I had to, first of all, leave academia in order to get closer to what I was looking for, because everything was so couched at a remove from what I was actually looking for. I'm going to go backwards in a second to show you how I came to systems like this. But what you're looking at now is actually called the Huyaware system. And it's, we have different communities in Ghana. One of them is the Ewe people. And I just wanted to start with this because this is one of the knowledge systems that I've come across within my research. And I'm starting with the end in a way. But when I came across this, I was kind of astounded because it was a very complete system. It encompassed mythology, the arts, education, politics, knowledge of nature, knowledge of the soul, science and technology. And it was a complete system of knowledge that had been passed down for thousands of years. And it kind of started me off on this journey that I'm on now, which is really looking at indigenous knowledge systems. And I'm not a big fan of that term, indigenous knowledge systems, because as someone, pointed out to me, these are knowledges that are ours. Why do we differentiate between indigenous and other knowledge? So, within the process of my work, it's also about coming up with concepts and terms that are actually not yet in existence, and maybe stripping away at some of the concepts that we have now. But what was really interesting in this indigenous knowledge systems, and I came across it through individuals that call themselves knowledge keepers. And like I said, I'll go backwards in a minute to show you how I came upon these knowledge keepers. But what I had, and again, this comes down to the notion of mistranslation. I had thought when I met these people, I'd known them for a while as artists and then musicians, and I thought they were traditional priests. And so I'd come to talk to them and interview them as traditional priests, and they said to me, we're not priests because, traditionally we didn't have religion. We had knowledge systems. And so we're knowledge keepers. And I was like, okay. And it was, over the course of a few years that they eventually revealed the system to me and everything that comes with it. And while looking at the system, I found that the reason that it took me a while to get to the system is because it's a system that is seen as something that you need to be careful with. It's not, this kind of form of knowledge is not something that's passed on to people who are uninitiated, that don't understand its purpose or meaning. There are different forms to come to this knowledge. Music is one of them, arts is one of them. But what the knowledge keepers say is that in order to hear, your inner music, you have to cultivate the outer music. They say that, in order to find these mysteries, you've got to return to yourself. There's a lot of inner excavation work that comes with this kind of learning of this type of knowledge. And so from the very beginning, it was such a different form of knowledge excavation to the one that I'd been taught from Western academic systems. It was one that very much involved the self, and looking into the self, and this beautiful kind of concept of the unification of the soul of a being with the essence of the object. It was a whole nother starting point for me, and it's a journey that I'm still on. And the interesting thing is that as I've gone on to this journey, the conversations that I've been having have been conversations across the global south. I know that in the West, for example, right now, there's this whole process of decolonization that's happening, but it's actually almost like we're circumventing this decolonization narrative for these conversations that we're having across Kenya and Senegal and Brazil, Colombia, etc. which are bringing into being these new paradigms, these new concepts, these new narratives. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I came to this. One of the things that, once I started looking into, what are these concepts and forms within which we have created our forms of expression, I also started to look more deeply into something that had struck me for a long time, which is that, I'd go home from being at university in London, and I'd go home and I'd see the very same objects that would be in, for example, the British Museum, behind glass cases in temperature-controlled rooms, in, for example, the courtyards of the palace at home, or at different events. The Batakari, the wall smock that you see, which is in the Smithsonian, and then on the right you see on one of my cousins at one of these events when he's performing the stance. And so I started looking into this idea of historicization, this idea of display, this idea of exhibition making. Why is it that we have this one supposed standard for the keeping of objects? One thing that we've heard a lot in the restitution debate, which is kind of, so trendy and fashionable at the moment, is Western museum directors saying with, outrageous arrogance, can they look after their objects if we give them back to them? Which, is just the kind of depth and, I actually have no words to describe that. But, it's kind of setting up the Western museum model as the pinnacle of development, like, every other kind of form of Western epistemology and knowledge making. It's the height of civilization, and it's something that we, as the so-called underdeveloped, are supposed to be moving towards. But what if, that wasn't the case? What if there was more of an idea of relativism? What if instead of this, linear progression where the West is the end and everyone else is following, what if there was something much more interesting, which is a kind of relativism of being, in which different ways of being, of discovering, of knowledge, of existing, stand side by side? And so as I was asking myself these questions, I, again, came homewards, and again, back to the knowledge system where you look into yourself and into your own context as a starting point. We have these events in Ghana. This is actually in my hometown. It's actually the 75th anniversary of my granddad's death. And we have these things called afashie. Again, there's a mistranslation that happens there. They're translated as Durbas or festivals. Durbar obviously comes from the Indian and comes, from the colonial context. But afashie actually means the meeting of the years. And there are these ceremonies that we have at certain times within our calendar. We have traditionally a 42-day calendar, and we have these different ceremonies that come at different points in this calendar. And so for me, the afashie really became these kind of, almost like these living museum models, these kind of Gesamtkunstwerke or total works of arts where, you had these cloths sometimes, like for example, if you look in the top left-hand corner, if you look at the orange cloth of the Asante Hini, who's the Asante king, this was the first time the Asante king and the Achim king had met since 1717, when the Asante king had crossed the river and our king had, killed him, and there'd been all kinds of, animosity as a result of that. But as a result of that, the Asante king wasn't allowed to cross the river Pra to come back to us. And so this was the first time they were meeting. This was a couple of years ago. And the cloth that the Asante Hini is wearing is actually one from the 18th century. And, it struck me at these afashie and at these meetings, these objects, these drums, these cloths come out, and they've been kept for sometimes 300, 400, 500 years. There's forms of preservation and of historicization that we have cultivated for many, many years. And what are those? And how do I start to translate them in ways that are equitable to the ways that we all know? So in short, that's kind of my starting point and my question. this is something, a culture encyclopedia, which I've developed as an attempt to categorize and order these questions. And then this is, oops, I think I'm missing a slide, sorry. Oh, I think I missed the slide. I also have a mobile museum project, which for some reason is not here, but it's a mobile museum that travels into communities across Ghana and is an attempt to deconstruct the kind of centralized form of the museum model, and it's a shame that the slide is not here. And then this is the idea of bringing the mobile museum back into the museum context.
Good evening, I'm Natalia Romik. I'm very happy to be here among such a distinguished guest. Thank you, Dan David Committee, and I'm really happy that I'm with you today, and we will talk about objects. I'm designer and also architect and artist sometimes, but I think always architect. My research and practice is dedicated to the investigation and mostly preservation of Jewish heritage in Europe, mostly synagogues, ritual bath places in Poland, and my research also coming in Ukraine, Belarus. So I would say that my research and also practice cope with the problem of urban emptiness and the spectral architecture of abandoned Jewish properties in a former shtetls in Poland, formerly Jewish town. Probably all you know, shtetls mean in Yiddish, shtetelech, small towns, small Jewish towns. So in this following artworks and performances that I will share with you right now, I try to reinvigorate the cultural memory and also preserve the architectural substance by interweaving in the processes and negotiating the new function and also speak with the local inhabitants in the shtetls right now. So my main question that I will share with you today is like how to restore the Jewish legacy in Poland, where there are no Jewish people. Can architectural memory and this conversion into something very new can be a remedy and also quality in the new contemporary life in the shtetls? So also we should remember that after 1945, after the Second World War, in the former Jewish towns has become occupied by new population. I mean Polish, Ukraine, Belarusian population, and also all this create a very new specific set of the social, urban and architectural problems, which I'm coping every day, not only because architect and artist never works alone. I work with an amazing group of the scholars and coalitions and with my collective Senna. Here what you can see, it's a first approach to negotiate the new function in the 18th century synagogue in Chmielnik, which is in the heart of Poland. This synagogue was completely destroyed by Germans, and my design approach was to regenerate or think about the new tissue of this bima in the heart of the synagogue. Although the bima was completely destroyed, and half of my research is always I'm starting in archive in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. I found exactly the same picture how the bima looks like in the 30s. But I thought it was quite unethical to rebuild the bima how it was before. And then was the idea to think about the new substance, like a 3-tone of glass, which is right now in the heart of the synagogue and which we are providing the Museum of the Świętokrzyskie region, Museum of the Shtetl. Here what you can see, it's a yad, big mobile hand. Yad means in Hebrew hand, for those of you that you don't know Hebrew. And this is my tool. This is one of my tools. I call them shamas. Shamesh, helpers, that help me to achieve goals, to bring everything what I will find in an archive in Warsaw, but also in some archives in Lublin or in Lviv, and to spread the historical knowledge about the past, like Itzkor book, memory books, historical pictures, and the drawing and maps left by the Jewish community before the war, and spread the architectural knowledge into the local community. So Yad was this kind of practical mobile tool, and the second was a nomadic shtetl archive. So I thought, when we can achieve this goal together with my coalitions and also work in a small shtetls back and also spread the knowledge about the past, why not to build larger archive and then speak with the local community about the Jewish past. Of course, architecture is a tool that we can also speak about local pogroms, pogroms made by Poles, anti-Semitism, restitution of their property, because also we should remember that Warsaw, for example, was bombed in a 90%, but still this Yiddish land in Poland is still existing from this architectural perspective. So also my goal was to spread the knowledge from the past and using the tools from the architecture and also art values. As a designer, I'm also working with the restoration and design. Here you can see this is the beautiful 19th century Jewish pre-funeral house in Gliwice, in Silesia region, where together with my collective, we redesigned this building to the Upper Silesian Jewish Museum, receiving 2 years ago nomination for the European Museum of the Year, which was also not easy, because the history related with the German Jews now in a Polish region is very neglected. So that was very, very long archival work, and only due to the kind of musealization of the past, we were together able to achieve our goals. But still, if somebody will ask me what is more important, is nomadic tools that I use or the designing museums, it will be very, very hard to choose. In the end, I would like to share with you with my current research related to the Jewish hiding places during the Second World War. This is actually intellectual and as well artistic tribute to the people who built and also used these places, different places during the Holocaust. We should remember that Jewish people hid not only in a private houses dwelling, but also they used 3 hollows, wardrobes, urban sewers, caves, and also empty graves to survive Holocaust. Here you can see in this picture right at the bottom, it's myself with the dendrologist 2 years ago researching the tree in a Wiśniowa region in Podkarpacie, where the 2 brothers called Denholz hiding there for we don't know how long right now, but more than months. And inside the tree we found the stairs, 14 stairs, which the brothers were climbing up. And now, together with dendrochronologists, also we found evidence from which year the stairs are coming. And in my current exhibition in the National Gallery of Art in Warsaw, we are showing not only sculptures that I will show you in the last slide, but also whole investigation made together with amazing group of the specialists like historian, archaeologists, anthropologists, especially with Aleksandra Janus. And this research is very important for me because a part of the research, as you can see at the left of the top, it's a place in Ukraine where the Jewish family hid for more than a year in a sewer system in Lviv. Now we have a war in Lviv, in Ukraine, and the half of the cases that I was researching with amazing team, as well with the urban explorers from Lviv, are again used by Ukrainian people and women and children as well. Here you can see this, the sculptures and the cast 1-to-1 and scale 1-to-1 that we've produced in not only in Ukraine but also in Poland. Here, this big part is a part of the tree in Podkarpacie region, which is covered in a very high quality of silver. As they are for me monuments not only to the trauma of those times, but also this reminding how people having sometimes spoons, sometimes like small tools, they were able to build this reverse of the houses they lived for years. And in the last slide, you can see also 3D scans made with the optical camera and geodetic tools that we made together with a specialist from Częstochowa, actually every hiding place in a 3D clouds. So I hope after this exhibition, everyone can have access to the data and also see from the close-up how the hiding places were built. And I hope that will be also part of the new approach to the Holocaust. I call it like Holocaust by bullets, not only in Auschwitz and Treblinka, but also on the spot in small villages and tiny places. Yeah,
yes.
thank you.
Thank you very much. This is three very, very different positions, approaches, ways of proceeding, of uncovering traces of the past. And but I think at the same time, I would like also to stress what is maybe what are the similarities or what is common. There is an activist element in all of you, as maybe perhaps even in all Dan David Prize winners, there is an element of contesting what has been established as knowledge, and there is an urgent need to do something about it. And this, in the case of Nana, even includes rejecting academia, which is a very, very strong move, I believe, to say there is a different system called knowledge, and this is out of academia, and this has to be acknowledged also. I'm really fascinated by what we have heard today, talking about lenses or gaps between what is in the books, what is on the ground, and the establishing of counter-narratives, of writing history against the grain or between the lines. I think this continues the day, but the focus is different because this is not textual, like Daphna said, or written documentation, but we have 3D objects and we have architectural elements like traces. Now, I don't have questions for, let's say, the three of you individually, but I have questions that I would like to ask all of you, and whoever feels fine to answering them, please go ahead and we'll find out a system for this. My question is, you are all studying material culture in a broad sense. That means you are all also dealing with cultural heritage. Cultural heritage, by definition, is attributed, meaning is attributed by collective identities or mostly by nations. Nation states make use of cultural heritage for identity formation. This is very simply said. So to me, I wonder, is this collective identity aspect, is this a neutral thing? I think yes. If it includes national, there is always a tainted narrative coming along with it. So how do you deal with, let's say, the identity building aspects of your work? So to what degree does this interfere with your research, or strengthen it, or put additional fire onto it, whatever? So who's going to answer first?
Maybe first and quick answer. It's a really great question, very hard, because in my case, working in a shtetls and following of the footprints of this kind of hantological value, there is no Jewish community in the small towns where they are They are very poor, quite big unemployment. It's very hard to think about the new museum, for whom we are doing, what we are dealing, what kind of history we are showing, how, for example, Polish people can have access to these difficult stories. It's also very, very complicated. So that was a time in my also PhD time in the Bartlett School of Architecture in UCL, having amazing supervisors from Jewish study and design and theory of architecture to reverse everything and also think how design actually and the material, post-material culture could achieve the goals that the local communities it's really needed, but also dealing with the difficult subject and having like no risk care. And especially for architects, that all you know, it's very hard to negotiate the new function of the museums for new cultural houses and how we can be really stubborn and going back and forth, sometimes really 1,000 times to the small villages and convince people that will be very good for them, maybe not now, but in the next few years. So in my case, also working in the Yiddish land that doesn't exist, only from this material perspective, was complete reverse.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
There's a lot of research that shows effectively how nationalism is always kind of also the flip side of colonialism. And so that's kind of how I would approach it. So also with a critical eye, and at least on the collective project that I introduced you to at the end of my presentation, that's not necessarily kind of stories we're looking for. It's more recognizing that something like cultural heritage and the very concept of cultural heritage is already a Western invention. And as you both showed, there are many ways of engaging with the material past. And so if you remember the photograph with the ruins, these women, they were taking care of the site of Palmyra, actually renovating and using objects, recycling them, rebuilding, using ancient temples as mosques or as a birth clinic even. We heard oral history on the BBC where someone describes that her mother is born in one of the temples. And so I'm trying to look for these kind of stories that are also about preservation, but also at the same time look at preservation again as the flip side of destruction. And if you remember what I said about the French forces going into these ruins and into these villages, that show that the Western heritage paradigm of cultural heritage almost always has also that history of destruction. And so it's about recreating stories that are sort of at the niche, at the marginal end of this material, and look for other ways of engaging with the material past through reuse, recycling, that doesn't always see the museum as the end point of that narrative.
In a way, it's a shame because the most important slide that I had got lost in sending somehow. But for me, in terms of national identity, cultural heritage, the most important project that I've worked on is this mobile museum that I've created, and kind of it's evolved over the years. And it's literally a mobile museum that travels into communities. I did have some images of it. And in that, for me, it's the most important project because it's actually asking people, what is culture to you? What is art to you? It's a co-creation project. It's asking people how would they like to see themselves resonate out. So it's actually the opposite in a way of the curation model that I learned, which is quite a top-down approach. You learn, you have a theme, you select the artists, and everything kind of fits into the paradigm that you create. And this concept of the mobile museum, as it's evolved, is really a listening concept. And for me, I think cultural heritage, national identity, at least in the context that I am living in, it's a listening project. Because I think for a very long time, there's been a lot of space filled in by others of how things are meant to look like and be described. So yeah, it's a listening project.
Thank you very much. This is, of course, I think, very much against the grain if you look at ordinary art history, canonical views. I mean, Neil MacGregor, I mean, this is the opposite of Neil MacGregor in many ways, I believe, because this is making the object speak and telling the story from what is there, as opposed to doubting the objects or questioning them and so on. My second question would be, I think we have no problem in accepting that heritage, cultural heritage, is the product of an asymmetry of power relations, because this is what shaped history to a large degree. If this is so, also our methods of preservation, of maintaining that heritage, have an element of prolonging or perpetuating this asymmetry of power. Can we, as responsible researchers, scholars, curators at that point, how do we work with that challenge? And whoever is going to answer first. Again.
Yeah, we must. Okay. Like, especially in a power relation. Now in Poland we have a new museum devoted to the history of the righteous among the nation, which I have no time to talk about it, but we know so very little about, for example, hiding and in the spread of the official monuments. Of course, John Paul II is actually growing in every corner in Poland and also in the small cities. I was thinking during the pandemic, because I spent more than a year researching the grave in the heart of the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw, where Abraham Karmi, he's now more or less 97, he's from Tel Aviv, hid during the war and he survived the Holocaust. This is in an empty grave. And my colleagues now, like Maya, Dalia, Kuba, they were able to go inside and see how the Jewish people built this hiding place, putting in the railways matzevot, and they were invisible in the cemetery. And my question is how we can commemorate this place, like something that is really reverse to the official narration. Also, is the archaeological, this investigation could be a monument? I think yes. Talking 2 years ago with Abraham Karmi, we thought that's supposed to be something very minimalistic and something that would be reversed to the official policy in Poland. And again, you said a lot about mobility and mobile archive and mobile museums. And yes, I believe that for example, anti-fascist studio that we built a few years ago, now is in Lublin, it's much stronger than really any exhibition that I made in this subject. So the mobility and also this reverse to the current policy, in my case, in a Polish case, is very important, and we should promote it, speak about it with students, and yeah, to encourage them to this approach.
I mean, to say something self-critical about my own project, I mean, I find it really difficult still to think about it as something that is correcting power structures. For example, we're not paying people to pay for the website. And I think that is a problem, for example. And so it's not just about what kind of stories, but also who benefits, who gets credit, who is on the top of these power structures, and who determines how these kind of projects are directed. And so I, for example, would not want to call myself a director of the projects. So it's also about titles and hierarchies and things like that. And Neil MacGregor, by the way, he reached out and he says that he loves it, and so that's great. But at the same time, he also kind of implied, oh, that was the whole point of it, you know? And I said, no, I don't think so. Because it is a very, obviously the underlying idea is that there is a universal narrative of the encyclopedic museum, and that comes across quite forcefully in this book. And what people, like our authors do, they take an object like the Rosetta Stone from Egypt, and an Egyptian scholar tells the story of Rashid, which is where that object came from, and actually shows that the people of Rashid have been involved in the deciphering process. And so there's this whole local narrative. But at the same time, we would be helping the British Museum if we do that kind of work for free, right? That everyone now feels they should be doing. So there's a real issue also with this project, and that's something we have to work out. But also I find really interesting, for example, the use of replica, because it's such a kind of dirty word, why a replica? That's not what we want. We want the real stuff. And so obviously with the repatriation discussion, that is something that we should be talking about more, because it can be empowering also. It depends on who makes these things and who brings things into the museum, as you said, Nana, and where, who decides what a museum is and what's inside it and where it is located. So I think there is a lot to do in terms of undoing the institutional and the financial structures of these kind of spaces.
The question had to do with symmetries of power, right? I don't know, I think when I started on this journey, I was a lot more idealistic than I am now, in terms of, I had this idea that, if we all worked hard enough, within my context, we could bring about this cultural revolution and, we would be in some way enlightened or, at least in some kind of equal, not enlightened in the metaphysical sense, but like in a kind of, something would be undone, something would be achieved and accomplished. Not that we're not achieving anything, but I've kind of reversed. I guess I've become more realistic in that, we work within these power systems. Even my own role within the Ghanaian or the African arts ecosystem, happens because I happen to live in London for 10 years. I have access. I have privilege in that way that I can, bring the Ghana Pavilion to Venice Biennale, etc. These power dynamics, even as we try and undo them, perpetuate in other ways. And so that even as hard as I try to undo existing power relations, to some extent I have to engage with them and speak the language of these power narratives. And so from this kind of utopian viewpoint that I had at the beginning, of this kind of democratic, inclusive model that maybe we could achieve if we only worked hard enough, I've come much more to this kind of process-based approach, which is in the doing, that, at every point as we take these steps, it's in the steps that the doing is done, if that makes sense. Yeah, no,
makes perfect sense, because there is also the utopian element of the digital humanities. Collections online, images available everywhere, and nobody's really reflecting, let's say, the power structures or the electricity, with our environmental history person here, the electricity that is needed to have digital images available for everyone up and running. And I'm just, there are, because this is about material culture, and there is so much that, let's say, the digital can achieve, but also a lot of things that get lost on the way, on the process. And this maybe also boils down to the question of accessibility. The mobile museum gets the objects to the communities, which is a way of bonding or putting up connections. Looking at the depot, the storage part of the museum is also making things, the invisible, to uncover this, make it accessible. And you are, let's say, investigating the hideouts themselves. This is also, let's say, uncovering something that has been covered. So I don't have a question right now, but with those thoughts, I would like to open the floor to the audience.